Which teams could make the college football playoff for the first time in 2025? This used to be a much simpler question to ask when we were in the 4-team playoff era. There were very few select teams that could make a run to the college football playoff, and very few exceptions to what we normally saw. We had like a run from TCU that one season that was pretty crazy. We had Cincinnati making it out of the group of 5, which was pretty unprecedented in that year. But for the most part, it was pretty predictable who would wind up in the Final Four at the end of the season and in the college football playoff. But in a season with a 12-team playoff, there's a lot more possibilities and answers to that question. So in today's video, we're going to set out to answer which new teams will make the college football playoff for the first time. We're going to go conference by conference, starting with the ACC. The ACC now at 17 teams with Stanford, SMU, and Cal just jammed in there just for good riddance, because that's what modern conference realignment looks like. But for starters, we have to take out any team that has already made the college football playoff, whether that be in the 12-team era or the 4-team era. So removing those teams, that removes Clemson, SMU, and Florida State. No other ACC team has ever made the college football playoff, which is pretty crazy, a pretty small amount for a conference, but really it was Florida State and Clemson during the whole 4-team playoff era, and then SMU most recently in the 12-team playoff. So that leaves us with 14 teams here for the ACC that are candidates to potentially make their first playoff appearance this season. Now, we can narrow this down a little bit further by going with teams that I would say actually have a shot. You look at teams like Wake Forest and Stanford that got rid of their head coach or lost their head coach and now have a first-year head coach that I don't think can just turn things around and win the ACC in year one. You have a team like Pitt that ended on a 6-game losing streak. That's not exactly an inspiring way to end the season. Virginia missed a bowl game, and I don't think we're going to be seeing a crazy turnaround comeback this season. We've got a team like Cal that's been battling through mediocrity. They had their defensive coordinator poached very recently, so I don't think they're going to do it. And then Boston College, who has struggled historically with mediocrity a ton, and even though Bill O'Brien's doing some good things, I don't think this will be the year. So this leaves us with 8 teams left that I think actually have a shot. Maybe a shot in the complete dark, but a shot nonetheless. But if we had to whittle this down a little bit further, I think we can do that. I think we can do that by looking at a team like North Carolina. It's Bill Belichick's first year. They have a manageable schedule. They could probably make the college football playoff, but it's not likely. There's too many things working against the Tar Heels. NC State, they were pretty disastrous this last season overall, and returning to form that quickly, I'm not sure it'll happen. Virginia Tech has clearly had a ceiling. Duke is a team that, won 9 games last season. That was great, but their schedule gets a lot tougher and it gets more tumultuous. Georgia Tech and Syracuse make me think a little bit more, but at the end of the day, both of them just have way too daunting of a schedule they're facing. And so I think when we're talking about the teams most likely to make it that will keep as candidates, it's going to be Miami and it's going to be Louisville. So those will be the 2 teams that we'll come back to when we finish with every conference. The next conference is going to be the SEC. With 16 teams in the SEC, there's a sizable amount that have made the college football playoff, 6 to be exact. We're going to get Georgia, Texas, Tennessee, LSU, Alabama, and Oklahoma out of here because they don't qualify because they've already made the college football playoff. So that leaves us with each of these teams. Now to narrow it down just a little bit further, we've got to take out teams that will not have a shot this year. Kentucky was pretty disastrous, and I do not think Stoops is going to have a team that suddenly breaks through to a new ceiling that they've never had before. Mississippi State will probably still be growing in year 2 under Jeff Lebby. Vanderbilt, talent-wise, still isn't there. Could have another pleasantly surprising season, though, under Clark Lee. And then Arkansas, I just think too much working against those guys and Sam Pittman and company. So that leaves us with 6 teams in the SEC that I think actually have a shot. The thing that's working against these teams in the SEC is the fact that they're not likely to win the SEC. It's mostly just going to be those top-line teams, the Alabamas, the Georgias, the Texases of the world, at least speaking in the context of maybe last season, although I know Alabama wasn't quite that close, so that sounds a little silly to say. Maybe Tennessee in the context of last year. But it's working against them. They're not likely to get that auto bid just for winning the conference. They have to do it as an at-large team, which is still doable and possible as an SEC team. But I think when you're talking about that, I don't think Auburn's a very realistic one. I know that there's the crazy upside flash potential they could do from a really young team. I just don't think it'll happen. Missouri's a team that I'm not sure they got a ton better, and their schedule is pretty easy and pretty manageable, but just consistency-wise over the full season, will they be able to do that? Ole Miss, I think slightly less talented than they were last year, and last year they couldn't make the CFP. So I think if we're talking most likely to make it, we're looking at some of our offseason darlings like South Carolina and Florida. A lot of people are high on them. And then Texas A&M. The talent level is totally there. Year 2 under Mike Elko. Who knows what happens in year 2? So those will be the 3 SEC teams we revisit later. In the Big Ten, we're going to start with a whopping 18 teams. This conference has gotten to a pretty insanely large number. First, we've got to take out the teams that have already made the college football playoff out of this conference, which is going to be Ohio State, Oregon, Penn State, Indiana, Washington, Michigan, and Michigan State. Spartans, if you remember, making the college football playoffs in the second year that the playoff was around, which was one of the more remarkable runs that honestly doesn't get talked about enough. But when we're talking about these remaining Big Ten teams, the teams that I don't really think have a shot are going to be Purdue and Maryland and Northwestern and Wisconsin, just too far off the mark last season. And then there's a few more that I think about, like UCLA and Rutgers. UCLA I don't think is well coached enough. Rutgers, I just think we're not talking about a high enough talent level. So once again, the same conundrum. It's harder to get the or the automatic bid out of the Big Ten. There's some really excellent top line teams. And so when we're talking about teams that are actually likely to make it, I think maybe we're looking at USC, Minnesota, Illinois here. There's a lot of offseason buzz for Illinois and a fair amount for USC. I think people can see the vision. Most people can. But Minnesota, let's say they're our Indiana-esque team. I know Nebraska is also a candidate there, but based on what we have seen, Minnesota was a much better team than Nebraska this last season. So I think those are going to be the 3 teams we're rocking with Iowa. It's just the inconsistency offensively speaking. I know they're improving. I know Tim Lester's doing good things, but we're going to, for now, for the purposes of this video, move forward with these 3 teams. Over in the Big 12, we've got another conference jam-packed with 16 teams in there, and there's going to be 3 of them that have made a college football playoff in the past. Arizona State, TCU, and Cincinnati that won't be considered here. And so that leaves us with these 13 Big 12 teams where when we're talking about teams that actually have a shot, there's a fair amount of them because a lot of teams can win this conference, but I think we can safely take UCF, West Virginia, and Houston and Arizona out of here. A couple of those teams breaking in a year 1 head coach, and then with Houston and Arizona, things were bad enough last year that it's relatively safe to say, but who knows? Arizona State would have been one of the first teams I took out of this last season. They ended up winning the conference, but we're trying to just narrow it down. We have actually has a shot versus most likely to make it. We're just going to, for the purposes of this exercise, pluck Oklahoma State and Utah out of there, saying things were so disastrous, it's not a 1-year bounce back Big 12 title season for them. Colorado has to replace a lot, including the Heisman Trophy winner, and then Kansas. They missed a bowl game, same as Utah and Oklahoma State. So we're going to be left with these 5 teams from the Big 12 that I think could all win the conference and be their first time in the college football playoff, which is a pretty high number, but it's because that auto bid is more attainable for more programs. We've got the independents in the Pac-12 to talk about briefly. Notre Dame's already made it, so they're disqualified, and I don't think UConn has what it takes strength of schedule-wise or even roster-wise. Washington State has a ton of turnover. Maybe we're talking about Oregon State this year. If any team could do it out of those ones, it could be the Beavs. So just because that maybe is a possibility, we'll move forward with Oregon State with some of the additions they made. They play 5 power conference opponents. Of the 12 teams on their schedule, they recruit and acquire talent better than 9 of them. So if they win 1 or 2 games they're not supposed to, maybe they're in the conversation. We're talking about the American Conference here. The American looks a lot different recently. I think when we're talking about most likely to make it out of the American, we're probably honing in on some of those top programs like Memphis, Tulane, East Carolina, UTSA, and South Florida. Ironically, some of the teams that are talked about most in realignment are also some of the teams that I think are most likely to emerge out of the American. Then there's, of course, the Mountain West, where Boise State has actually already made the playoff out of the Mountain West, so they're out of consideration. And out of the remaining teams most likely to make it, there's actually been a bit of flux in the Mountain West recently, and so I think we're talking about UNLV, Colorado State, and Fresno State from that conference, which takes us to the Sun Belt, where we've got a 14-team conference. And of the 14 teams in here, I think if we're talking in a playoff context, there's a lot of teams that potentially could win the Sun Belt, but teams that are good enough to not only win the Sun Belt, but be unscathed enough to have the best group of 5 resume. I really feel like it's going to come down to James Madison and Texas State, who are 2 of my favorite teams in the Sun Belt for next season. Then, of course, there's the MAC. The MAC has had some historically great teams come out of there, like some of those Kent State and Northern Illinois teams, Western Michigan, the one year they went undefeated under PJ Fleck. But in the MAC, I think most likely to make it and successfully navigate a non-conference stretch, we're talking about Ohio, Miami of Ohio, and Toledo, some of those top programs from the MAC. Then, of course, finally, there's the CUSA, where a bunch of programs that are either transitioning from the FCS or successfully have very recently. Not a ton of programs that'll be on the national radar, but if there's a couple of teams that could do it, it's got to be Liberty and Western Kentucky. They've been the top 2 programs in this conference recently. Those are the 2 teams that we'll move forward with from there. So let's start by figuring out who our most likely group of 5 team would be, because we've got all these group of 5 teams that we just plucked out of there. There can only be one that makes it. There technically can be more, but history tells us and the future tells us that it's going to be very rare that 2 group of 5 teams get bids. If you look historically at the top 12 teams and teams that would have made it out of conference champions, there was one season where you would have had 2, and that was the 2020 season. I believe it was Cincinnati and Coastal Carolina that year that would have qualified and both made the 12-team playoff. But for the most part, we're talking about 1. And the 2 traditionally most powerful group of 5 conferences are the Mountain West and the American. So I think we're most likely talking about them. They have the most brand recognition, which actually helps in this case because the committee's terrible. They're going to be teams that also play tougher non-conference schedules and can build a more compelling resume, and then have tougher strength of schedule from the teams they play in conference. So we're left with these teams, and then I think something that's really important and something we typically seen from these teams that arise is that they have a strong winning culture. I don't think you could argue that after just a couple successful seasons, UNLV fully has that yet. Colorado State's still working on their winning culture. UTSA still has a lot of history to unravel of not being a strong winning team. And I think we're really left with Tulane, Memphis, and Fresno State as the 3 programs that really have a strong winning culture. And the most tried and true team out of those 3 with the most veteran head coach is Memphis. So for now, we're going to pick Memphis as our group of 5 team to make their first ever college football playoff appearance. With the remaining power conference teams we pulled and also Oregon State, we're looking at them and we're asking how many first-time college football playoff teams are there on average if we were talking about a 12-team playoff. So we're looking at since 2014. Obviously, if the 12-team playoff was in effect in 2014, we would have seen 12 new teams. And then obviously for the first couple of seasons, it's going to be an unusually high number because the playoff wasn't in effect before that. So then we would have 6 newcomers and 7 and 4 and 5 and 1. And you can see it starts to dip as you continue on. And really what we're honing into is those last couple of years there, 3, 2, 2, 4. It's about an average of 3 newcomers that make the playoffs recently, which I think is going to be the most accurate thing for determining how many teams will be first-time playoff teams for this next season in the 12-team playoff era. And so first, I think if we're talking about who has the clearest path to make it, that's going to include teams that realistically can win their conference or have a manageable enough schedule. And I think right off the bat, that gets rid of some teams. Like Florida's schedule is just too brutal to be able to trust. I think every Big 12 team qualifies for this as a clear path because I think every Big 12 team can feasibly win the Big 12 this season. So that's going to get those teams like Baylor, BYU, Iowa State, Texas Tech, Kansas State through. Louisville and Miami are both teams I think can win the ACC. Minnesota and Illinois, I think that there is a path there in the Big Ten because they don't have the best depth in the Big Ten, and they can take advantage of that like Indiana did. So we narrow it down just a little bit there, and then when we're talking about the number of teams in each conference, it's likely only going to be 1 from the Big 12 that's a newcomer, and 1 from the ACC because those conferences might only get 1 bid. The ACC barely got 2 bids, and you've got to imagine Clemson or SMU or Florida State are in that picture. And then if we're talking about the Big 10 too, I think it's only likely to be like 1 from the Big 10 because the Big 10 already has Oregon and Penn State and Ohio State and Michigan all at the top that are likely going to be vying for playoff spots, and it's not likely that many more teams beyond that are there. So we sort of have to pick 1 from each, and I'm just going to sort of, not necessarily randomly, but pick teams that I think are either due or have a good shot. I think Louisville with Miller Moss at quarterback under Jeff Brom could finally break through this year. They beat Clemson on the road last season. They get a host them this year. That's a rite of passage almost. They could definitely win the ACC. Kansas State and Chris Kleiman are right there every year. This could be a window year where they shoot the gap and win the Big 12. Illinois, I don't think they'll win the Big 10, but you could totally see them doing an Indiana style 11-1, 10-2, getting that at-large spot. And then Texas A&M is the lone SEC team we have left that is sort of sitting in the mix there, which leaves us with 4, which is sort of one above, but there's going to be outliers here and there. And so that leaves us with these 5 teams as our, I guess, predicted through this video, first-time college football playoff teams in 2025. Illinois, Texas A&M, Louisville, Kansas State, and Memphis. This was not an exact science. Clearly, we just sort of went along there. I didn't even really know what teams I was going to pick at the start of this video, but using some historical stats, using some logic, using some process of elimination, these are the 5 teams that I think are most likely to be first-time college football playoff teams in 2025. If this is right, we're definitely revisiting this. This is going to be a great video for me. If this misses the mark completely, you'll never hear from me again, or at least hear from me talking about this video, that's for sure. But that's all I got for you guys today. Thank you for watching this video. I know I've been slacking a little bit with the videos on this channel, but we got plenty of more great content coming out for you guys as we continue to push towards that 20K subscriber mark. So I appreciate you guys for following and doing all that great stuff. Make sure you're subscribed if you're not already. Some of you think you are, but you actually aren't. So just go ahead and double check that for me. I appreciate it. And that's all I got for you guys. I will see you guys later this week.